Wait, what did you just say? Jane's hands trembled, the soup she brought him still steaming in her grip. The man in the wheelchair looked up, eyes wet. He spoke softly, but what he said made her drop the bowl, and every head inside Maggie Miley's turned toward them. The sound of shattered glass was nothing compared to what came next. No one in Beaufort was ready for the truth. The sun had barely risen over Beaufort, Illinois, a town where time moved slow and everybody knew your business, whether you liked it or not. At the corner of Sycamore and Main sat Maggie Miley's, an old-school American diner with checkered floors, red booths, and the scent of sizzling bacon that hit you the moment you walked in. It was the kind of place where folks ordered the usual, where local truckers read yesterday's paper, and where people noticed if your apron had a new stain. Jane stood behind the counter, tying the waist of her faded uniform. She was 28, maybe 29, though the fatigue in her eyes made her seem older. Black, beautiful and burdened, she moved like someone used to holding the weight of others' expectations, but still carried her head high. She filled coffee pots, cleaned menus, took orders, smiled at regulars, and most importantly, she noticed things. She noticed the lonely, the ignored, and especially the man in the wheelchair who sat just outside the diner window, rain or shine. No one really knew where he came from. He didn't beg. He didn't speak. Just sat with his shoulders hunched, eyes shielded beneath a worn-out ball cap, wrapped in layers of threadbare clothes and silence. Some said he was a vet. Others thought he was just another addict wasting away. Most ignored him. But Jane didn't. Every morning before the rush, she'd pack a bowl of soup or a hot sandwich, walk out the front door, kneel beside his chair and offer it with a soft smile. "Here you go, sir. You got to keep warm today." He'd always nod, sometimes offer a whisper of "thank you," but most days, he just looked at her, like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Inside the diner, Jane was just a waitress. Outside, she was the only kindness some people ever knew. On the other side of town, a world Jane didn't know existed was unfolding. Connor Brown, 52, sat in the back of a black SUV parked across from the diner. He wore the same ragged layers, the same battered wheelchair. But inside the car, his back was straight, his suit crisp beneath the disguise, and his assistant sat nervously beside him, holding a tablet filled with data, video footage, and transcripts. "Today's the day?" the assistant asked, not looking up. Connor nodded slowly. "She's the only one who never flinched." He reached down and grabbed his gloves, the ones he wore to cover the scar across his left palm, a remnant from the accident that nearly ended his life and the life he'd lived before it. A year ago, Connor Brown had vanished. The media claimed he'd disappeared. Billionaire, tech mogul, philanthropist, investor, gone without a trace. They didn't know he'd chosen to become invisible on purpose. They didn't know he'd traded mansions for bus stops. They didn't know he was looking for something, a reason to believe in people again. And he'd found it, in a poor black waitress who never asked for anything in return. Back inside Maggie Miley's, Jane wiped down a booth and snuck a glance out the window. The man was there as always, but something in his eyes felt different today. Sharper, more focused, like he was finally seeing her too. She felt a sudden flutter in her chest, like something important was coming, but she couldn't name it. And just like that, the pieces began to move. That day, Jane didn't just take him soup. She placed it gently in his lap and lingered. "You okay today?" she asked softly. "You look different." The man looked up. His voice came like gravel breaking through ice. "I need to tell you something." Then he looked away, and Jane walked back into the diner, her mind buzzing. The next morning, the rain came hard. Beaufort didn't get storms often, but when it did, the sky broke open like it was mourning something the ground had forgotten. Jane arrived at Maggie Miley's soaked to the bone, her sneakers squishing with every step. Still, she tied her apron, smiled at the cook, and started brewing the first pot of coffee like always. But today didn't feel like always. Today felt like something was waiting. Out front, the man in the wheelchair hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched as the storm drenched his shoulders. His head was bowed low, hands folded tightly over his lap, like he was praying or preparing for war. Jane watched him from behind the glass. Her fingers gripped the counter tighter than usual. Something's different. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the diner bell jingled. But this time, it wasn't a customer. It was him. The crippled man in the wheelchair, for the first time, entered the diner. Jane's breath caught in her throat. The rain dripped from his coat as he wheeled slowly across the tile. Not a single person spoke. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died. The only sound was the soft whir of his wheels. He stopped in front of her, looked up. "Do you have a minute?" His voice was clear, calm, softer than she expected. Jane nodded, barely. "I want to talk," he said. "Not out there, in here." She hesitated for just a second, then grabbed a clean towel from beneath the counter and motioned him toward the corner booth by the window. It was the booth no one ever sat in. Too cold, near the draft. Today it felt like the only place in the world. He didn't speak right away. Jane poured 2 cups of coffee, slid one across the table, then sat across from him, folding her hands nervously in her lap. His eyes, they weren't like they were before. They weren't lost. They were searching. He took a deep breath. "I've been watching you, Jane." The hair on her arms stood up. He continued slowly, like each word had to be pulled from somewhere deep. "You've fed me every day for 6 months, even when you had nothing, even when your hands were shaking from holding back tears. You never looked down on me. You never turned your face." Jane's mouth opened slightly, but she couldn't speak. He leaned forward. "I lied to you about everything." And then he stood, just like that, effortless, controlled, calm. Jane's eyes widened, her whole body stiffening. He stepped away from the chair, took off his coat. Underneath wasn't a threadbare sweater or a soaked shirt. It was a tailored suit, pressed, dry, expensive. The kind of suit no one in Beaufort had ever seen in person. He looked like someone who didn't belong. "My name is Connor Brown," he said quietly. "I'm a billionaire, tech, real estate, defense contracts. My face used to be on magazines, but after my wife passed, I lost faith in people, in the world, in humanity." He paused, looked at her. "So I became invisible. I needed to know if people were kind, when no one was watching." Jane's eyes filled with tears. "And you, Jane, you reminded me what good looks like." The coffee in her hands trembled. She wanted to say something, anything, but before she could, crash! The bowl of soup she had been holding slipped and shattered across the tile. Every head inside Maggie Miley's turned at the sound. The cook stepped out. The busboy froze mid-wipe. A regular muttered, "What the hell?" But Connor didn't flinch. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black card. "Call this number," he said softly. "Tomorrow. Don't be late." And with that, he walked back toward the door, leaving behind his wheelchair, his disguise, and the woman who had seen him before anyone else did. Outside, the storm had stopped. Inside, Jane had just witnessed something no one would ever believe. She stood frozen, eyes locked on the door long after it closed behind him. The soup, the chair, the suit, the name. Everything she thought she knew had just been rewritten in the space of 5 minutes. And everyone in that diner was still staring at her. And maybe you are too, because if you're still watching this story unfold, then maybe, just maybe, you believe there's still good people left in this world. And if stories like Jane's move you even a little, then please, take a second and subscribe. We tell real stories, with real hearts, for people who still believe kindness matters. Jane gave without expecting anything, and maybe today you can give too, with just one click. Back at the table, Jane picked up the card. Her fingers shook, her eyes burned, and her life would never be the same again. Jane didn't sleep that night. She didn't eat either. She just stared at the black card in her hand. No logo, no name, just a number printed in gold. embossed on a matte surface that felt like it didn't belong in her world. She turned it over again and again. Was that real? Was he really who he said he was? Why me? The next morning, she stood in front of the mirror at her tiny apartment, wrinkled apron on, the strap around her neck twisted. Her reflection looked like someone who'd been pulled out of one life and dropped into another. But the world around her hadn't gotten the memo. Back at Maggie Miley's, the town was already buzzing. The night shift waitress had posted a vague status on Facebook. You ever feed a man for months and then find out he's richer than everyone in town combined? The comments poured in, some supportive, some suspicious, some downright cruel. Fake. She's playing victim for clout. Who brings soup to a stranger every day and doesn't expect something in return? She's lying. Probably sleeping with him. By the time Jane walked through the diner door, she could feel the eyes on her like weight. The booth where Connor had revealed himself, empty now. The wheelchair, gone. But the whispers, very much alive. "Morning, Jane," said Marlene, the manager, her tone tight and rehearsed. "You're 5 minutes late." Jane nodded, heading to the back. She didn't mention the billionaire, didn't bring up the card, but people didn't need her to say anything. They had already filled in the blanks themselves. Later that afternoon, Clay, one of the cooks, leaned through the pickup window. "So, what's the deal with the mystery man?" he asked, smirking. "You dating him or writing a book?" Jane looked up from the coffee station, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't like that." Clay raised an eyebrow. "Right. Just soup and deep stares for half a year." He walked away laughing, but Jane stood there holding the coffee pot like a shield. "Why does it matter?" she whispered under her breath. "Why does it always have to be dirty when a woman does something kind?" The card burned in her pocket. She wanted to call. She almost did, twice. But every time she reached for her phone, that old voice returned. "He's gone now. You'll look stupid." It was probably a test. He was probably just playing you. It was safer to believe it hadn't happened than to hope it had, because hope could break you worse than disappointment. That night, she walked home alone. Beaufort had a way of turning cold, even when the weather didn't. She passed 2 women from church who nodded without smiling. An old classmate across the street who turned before she could wave. Even the gas station clerk who used to flirt with her didn't say a word when she bought milk. Jane wasn't a waitress anymore, not in their eyes. She was a story now, a rumor, a question mark. In his penthouse suite overlooking downtown Chicago, Connor Brown sat in silence, watching the footage from Maggie Miley's. His assistant stood nearby, hesitant. "She didn't call." Connor said nothing. "You told her to call you the next day. It's been 2. Still nothing. The assistant fidgeted. "Should we move on? The board's waiting on you. The investors—" Connor raised a hand. "She's scared, let her be." He paused the footage on a frame. Jane's face just before the bowl slipped from her fingers, frozen between recognition and heartbreak. Real people don't process miracles in 24 hours. Back in Beaufort, Jane lay in bed with the lights off. The card sat on her nightstand. The number glowed in the dark, catching the streetlight outside her window. She reached for it, then pulled her hand back. "If he really meant it," she whispered to no one, "he'd call me." But what if he was waiting for her too? What if this was the one door she wasn't supposed to shut? 2 days after the storm, Jane came into Maggie Miley's like nothing had changed. She poured coffee, cleaned tables, took orders with a forced smile that was starting to crack. The whispers hadn't stopped, but something else had. The man in the wheelchair. He never returned. The space outside the window where he used to sit, empty. And it hurt in a way Jane couldn't explain. Not because he was gone, but because now she had no proof he was ever real. Until 4:37 p.m., the bell above the diner door jingled once. Jane looked up. A man walked in, tall, polished, clearly out of place. Suit, sunglasses, Bluetooth in his ear. Not a customer. He didn't even look around. He walked straight up to the counter, leaned in, and said 2 words. "Jane Taylor." She hesitated. "Yes?" He slipped an envelope onto the counter. "Mr. Connor Brown requests your presence. You're late." Before she could respond, he was already out the door. Inside the envelope, a black card identical to the one he gave her, but this time it had a printed address, not a phone number, an invitation. That evening, Jane stood outside a steel gate guarded by two men in suits. Beyond the gate, a sprawling estate stretched into the tree line. White stone, clean edges, glass walls glowing under the dusk sky. She had never seen a place like this in real life. She almost turned around, twice. But something inside her, the same part that brought soup to a silent man every morning, whispered, "Go." Inside, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The butler led her through glass halls and marble floors, down a corridor of warm lighting and soft jazz, and into a private library. She stepped in, the door shut behind her. He was already there. Connor Brown. No wheelchair, no coat, just a black sweater and slacks, barefoot, sitting in a leather armchair, looking at her like he hadn't blinked since she left. Jane stood frozen. "You came," he said gently. She didn't answer. She couldn't. There was too much between them now. Too much said and too much unsaid. He motioned to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." She did, cautiously. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice low. "Why me?" Connor studied her for a long moment. "Because in 6 months, you were the only person who treated me like a man. Not a mistake." Jane blinked hard. "But you lied to me." He nodded. "I did." "You made me feel sorry for you." "No, I let you be exactly who you are, kind, without agenda. You passed a test you didn't even know you were taking." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "You had money, I had nothing, I was—" She caught herself. He waited. "I was barely keeping my lights on," she whispered. Connor's voice softened. "And yet you fed a stranger. Every single day." They sat in silence. A clock ticked somewhere above. The air felt like it was waiting for one of them to either scream or cry. But neither did. Instead, Connor stood and walked to a small cabinet. He opened it and pulled out a sealed manila folder. "This," he said, placing it on the table between them, "is everything you need to change your life. Your debts, your rent, your mother's care, your brother's tuition, covered. No strings, no catches." Jane stared at it like it was radioactive. "Why?" "Because kindness should be repaid with dignity," he said. "Not pity, not attention, dignity." She didn't touch the folder. "You could have just sent this in the mail," she said. He looked her in the eyes. "Would you have believed it was real?" The door opened softly behind them. The butler stepped in. "Dinner is ready, sir." Connor turned to Jane. "Stay. Eat with me." She hesitated. "Please," he added quietly. "No suits, no cameras, just you and me. Real." Jane didn't answer right away, but for the first time in days her shoulders softened. And for the first time since this began, she didn't feel like the poor girl with the soup. She felt seen. The dining room was warm, quiet, private. Nothing like the stiff formality Jane had imagined when she thought of billionaires eating dinner. The walls were lined with books. A fireplace flickered behind them. On the long oak table sat 2 plates, untouched. She hadn't moved since she sat down. Neither had Connor. "You're not eating," he said gently. Jane looked up from the file he'd given her, the one filled with account statements, paid invoices, legal clearances. "I don't know how to accept this," she admitted. "It feels too big, too fast." He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands. "You ever read about me before?" She shook her head. "Only after that day. A few headlines. Something about you disappearing after your wife died." Connor stared into the fire. "Her name was Olivia. We met when I was 19. She worked at the library on my college campus. First woman who ever told me I was talking too loud." He chuckled softly, but there was no joy in it. "We built everything together. Every company, every risk, every win. She was the reason I worked. And the reason I stopped." He paused. "Cancer. Fast. Brutal. By the time we found it, she had 3 months. She made me promise I wouldn't let grief turn me cruel. He looked at Jane. But I did. Jane didn't speak. She didn't have to. Pain recognizes pain. Connor continued, voice lower now. I went silent after the funeral, fired half my board, froze expansion, gave away my stock. The press called me unstable, but I wasn't unstable, Jane. I was angry. At the world? At people. They sent flowers to my house, then leaked photos to the tabloids. They offered condolences, then tried to buy my company the next day. I realized no one does anything without expecting something back. He looked at her now, fully. Except you. Jane swallowed hard. Her hand brushed the edge of her plate. Her throat burned. She hadn't told anyone this before, not even her roommate, not the priest at her old church. But somehow she knew he'd understand. My daddy used to pick up strays, she said. People, not dogs. Every holiday, there'd be someone at our table who didn't have anywhere else to go. Didn't matter if he drank or smelled or talked too loud. If he was hungry, he was welcome. She smiled faintly. He used to say, kindness doesn't cost nothing, baby girl. But it saves more than we know. Connor didn't interrupt. He died in a warehouse accident when I was 16, Jane continued. My mum never recovered. She stopped talking. My brother was just a kid. I got my first job a week after the funeral, and I've been working ever since. She looked at him. I don't give soup to strangers because I expect a reward. I do it because I remember how it felt to be invisible. Silence. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was shared. I wish I met your father, Connor said softly. He'd have liked you, Jane replied. No, he said, smiling faintly. He'd have liked that you didn't like me right away. She laughed, the first real laugh since it all began. Outside the window, it began to snow. Inside, for the first time, it felt safe to be vulnerable. They talked for hours, about their fears, their regrets, the versions of themselves they used to be. And somewhere between the laughter and the confessions, they stopped feeling like Billionaire and Waitress. They just became Connor and Jane. But before we go on, can I ask you something? If you've watched this far, if you've felt anything for Jane, or for Connor, or for what it means to be good even when no one's watching, then don't scroll past this without subscribing. Real stories like this take time to write, time to tell, and heart to craft. If you've got even a little heart left, use it now. Hit subscribe and stay for more. Back at the table, Connor finally stood and reached for the fireplace mantel. He pulled down a photo in a silver frame, one Jane hadn't noticed before. It was a picture of Olivia holding a bowl of soup, kneeling next to a woman in a wheelchair, a mirror image of what Jane had done all these months. Jane froze. That's why you chose me, she whispered. Because I reminded you of her. He looked at the photo for a long time, then turned to Jane. No, he said, because Olivia would have wanted me to become someone you could believe in. Jane didn't remember the last time she felt full, not just from food, but from company, from being seen. The second dinner with Connor wasn't in the dining room, it was in the kitchen. She had wandered in, curious, half-jokingly asking if billionaires ever actually cooked their own meals. Connor had smiled, rolled up his sleeves, and admitted he didn't even know how to boil an egg without setting off the smoke detector. You built satellites, Jane had teased, but you can't make toast? Toasters don't have user manuals, he shrugged. It was the first time she'd seen him laugh without pain behind it. They made grilled cheese, sort of. Jane cooked. Connor tried. The kitchen was filled with burnt crumbs, melted cheese, and the kind of laughter that came from places deeper than the stomach. Okay. You're officially banned from touching the stove, Jane grinned, wagging a spatula at him. That's fair, he said, wiping his hands with a towel. But I make a mean iced tea. He opened a cabinet, pulled down a pitcher, and began mixing it like he was running a science lab. What is that? Jane asked. My mum's secret recipe. Well, it's mostly sugar. They drank tea on the floor, backs against the cabinets. For a few quiet minutes, they didn't talk about the past, or money, or soup, or tests, or loss. They just sat and smiled and existed. "What happens now?" Jane asked softly. "Whatever you want to happen," Connor replied. "That's not helpful. It's honest." She took a long breath. "I've never been taken care of before. Not like this." He looked at her with that same focus he used to use when he was watching her outside the diner. "You're not being taken care of. You're being respected. There's a difference." She blinked, slowly. "That sounds like love," she whispered, almost laughing. "Then maybe love starts with soup," he said. For a moment she didn't feel like a waitress. He didn't feel like a billionaire. They just felt like two people trying to heal. Later that night she sat on the balcony overlooking the estate gardens. A soft breeze brushed her hair back, and Connor stepped outside with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. "I don't know what to do with good things," she said. "When you grow up holding your breath, it's hard to believe the air is clean." He sat beside her. "Then let's just sit in the silence," he said. "No decisions, no timelines, just this." And they did, for hours. No clock, no phones, no wait. Just two people watching the stars, feeling safe. Jane reached into her pocket. She pulled out the black card. The first one. "I kept it," she said. Connor smiled. "I know. You knew. I had them printed with micro tags. I can track who keeps them and who tosses them." Jane shook her head. "That's not romantic. That's creepy." "It's efficient," he smirked. She nudged him with her elbow. "You really are a billionaire. You really are the kindest person I've ever met." Silence again. But this time, it didn't need to be filled. It meant something. And maybe now, it's starting to mean something to you too. Because if this moment, this peace, this quiet, if it made you feel anything real, then take a second and hit subscribe. Not because we asked, but because stories like this, they remind us that softness still exists in a hard world, and if you made it this far, maybe that softness lives in you too. Later that night, before bed, Jane passed a hallway lined with framed photos. She paused at one. It was a black and white shot of Connor and his wife, Olivia, sitting at a cafe, grinning. She had a smear of whipped cream on her cheek. He was laughing. In that photo, he looked like someone who still believed people were good. She touched the edge of the frame. "She was beautiful," Jane whispered. Connor from behind her. "She would have loved you." Jane turned. "Do you think she'd be okay with all this?" Connor didn't hesitate. "She'd say, 'Don't miss your second chance, because you're still mourning the first.'" And Jane finally let herself cry, not because she was sad, but because she had finally been given permission to feel joy. The snow was falling harder now. Jane sat by the window of her apartment, knees pulled to her chest, the check still untouched on the table. Her eyes hadn't blinked in what felt like hours. On the TV screen, Connor's face was everywhere. Breaking. Tech billionaire Connor Brown resurfaces after months in hiding, seen with local waitress in now viral photos. Local waitress, that's what they were calling her. Not her name, not Jane, just a headline, a footnote in a scandal he never warned her about. She reached for the remote and shut it off. The silence after the noise was worse than the news itself. At the same time, just 90 miles away, Connor stood in his office, but it didn't feel like his anymore. It was glass and marble and power, but it felt empty. His board had delivered an ultimatum: cut ties with the girl or lose the empire. "You were supposed to be smarter than this," one of them hissed. "She's not your wife," another had said, quieter but crueler. He didn't respond, but their words didn't echo as loudly as the one voice that hadn't said anything at all. Jane. He hadn't called her. He hadn't warned her. And now she was out there, drowning in something he could have stopped, or at least prepared her for. He looked at the black card she had once carried. He wondered if she still had it. Jane hadn't left her apartment in 2 days. She didn't want to. The check sat there like a trap, clean, silent, cold. Was this all I was worth to him? A payout? A payoff? A thank you and goodbye? She played their conversations over and over in her head. The soup, the nights, the laughter, the promises. You're being respected. You're the kindest person I've ever met. Stay, eat with me. No suits. Just you and me, real. How could something that felt so real be so easily erased? She finally pulled out her phone, then deleted his number. If he cared, he'd have reached out by now. She stared at the check again, still uncashed, still bleeding dignity. That night she sat in the dark, hugging her knees, while outside Beaufort buzzed with rumors she couldn't silence. Down the hall her neighbor knocked once. "You okay in there?" the voice called gently. She didn't answer, because she wasn't. The next morning she woke up to a new headline. Connor Brown to speak publicly for first time in over a year. Press conference scheduled today at 2 p.m. Her stomach turned. In a hotel ballroom surrounded by reporters, camera flashes, and global eyes, Connor adjusted his microphone. Everyone expected a statement on the company, the disappearance, the money. But what came out of his mouth silenced the room. "This isn't about business," he said. "It's about truth. And I owe the truth to someone who never asked for anything but gave me more than I deserved." The room buzzed, but outside that room, in a small apartment in Beaufort, Jane didn't watch the speech. She turned the TV off before he could finish. Because now, she didn't want words. She wanted action. Meanwhile, as he stepped down from the podium, Connor finally made the call he should have made days ago. But the phone rang. Once, twice, then went to voicemail. "Jane, it's me. I should have protected you. I should have shown up for you. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I hope you still believe in what we had." Silence. "I believe in you." Back in her apartment, Jane sat by the window again. The phone beside her buzzed once with a missed call. She looked at the screen, but she didn't move. She needed time. But time doesn't always wait. The wind outside was picking up again, blowing snow sideways across the sidewalks of Beaufort, Illinois. Jane stood in the center of her living room, surrounded by everything she'd worked for, and suddenly it all felt so small. The stack of bills on the table, the cracked screen on her phone, the fridge that wheezed when it opened. It all used to feel like her life. Now it felt like a box, and she was suffocating inside it. She picked up the check, still uncashed, still untouched, still screaming in silence. What if this is all I'll ever get from him? What if this was never real? She pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Don't fall in love with a miracle if you're not ready for it to disappear. Her mother had said that once, years ago, back when Jane thought love was something she had to deserve. Across the city, in a penthouse that felt even lonelier now than it had in the early days of grief, Connor stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago's skyline blinked with light below him. But all he saw was her. Jane. In her apron, on her knees, holding out soup to a stranger with no name. And now, because of him, she was hurting. Because of his silence, his fear, his pride. He had failed to protect the only person who had protected him. He could have called again, he could have gone to her, but instead he stood there, afraid of the one thing that money couldn't buy: forgiveness. Jane folded the check in half, then again, and placed it in the drawer. She didn't tear it, she didn't cash it, she just put it away. If he really meant it, he'd come to me. But something deep inside her whispered, "You already know he won't." Later that night, Jane walked to the one place that had always felt honest, Maggie Miley's. It was closed, but she sat on the steps outside anyway, hands in her coat pockets, watching the quiet street that used to hold a man in a wheelchair. She missed him, not the billionaire, the man, the silent eyes, the presence that didn't ask for anything, that version of him. She trusted. The front door creaked open. It was Marlene, her manager. The older woman stepped outside and lit a cigarette. They didn't speak for a while. Then Marlene exhaled slowly. "I didn't believe it at first," she said. "Thought you were just another girl chasing a story." Jane looked over, surprised. "But then I saw how he looked at you," Marlene continued. Like he didn't want to be saved. He just wanted to matter to someone. Jane swallowed the lump in her throat. It was real, she whispered. And then it wasn't. Marlene dropped her cigarette. So go find out which version is the truth. At the same time, Connor was in his study, staring at a small box on his desk. He opened it. Inside, a bracelet. Olivia's. Her favorite piece. She wore it the day they met, the day she said yes, the day she left. He turned it over in his hands, thinking about the words she used to say when he doubted himself. You were never meant to live in your castle alone. And now, he was alone, even when someone had finally offered him a reason not to be. He pulled out his phone, paused, typed Jane's number, paused again, then hit delete, again. Because the truth was, he didn't know if he deserved to call, but maybe you know what he should do. Maybe you've been Jane before, trusting someone who walked away when it got too real. Or maybe you've been Connor, afraid of ruining the one thing that felt good. So now I'm asking you, not as a narrator, but as someone telling this story with heart, at this point, what do you think he should do? Should he follow his pride or follow his heart? Drop your answer in the comments right now, and if this moment moved you, even a little, subscribe. Not because we're asking, but because real stories like this, the kind that remind us what love costs, they're rare. And you're rare too, for still watching. Back in Beaufort, Jane walked home slowly, the wind pressing into her jacket. Every light in town felt too bright, every silence too loud. She stopped at her mailbox. Inside was a letter. No name on the front, just a white envelope, unmarked. She opened it with numb fingers. Inside, on clean stationery, typed in soft grey ink. I'm sorry. If you'll let me, I'd like to explain everything. In person. No cameras. No company. Just me. Connor. She stared at the note for a long time. Didn't smile, didn't cry, just stood there, holding her breath. The letter was still in Jane's hands as she stood at the threshold of Maggie Miley's the next morning. It was early, too early for anyone to be inside, but someone was. She opened the door slowly. There, sitting at the same booth by the window, the one where it all began, was Connor. No suit, no cameras, no entourage, just him. And in front of him, a bowl of soup. Jane froze. Her eyes filled, not with tears yet, but with memory. The cold mornings, the silence, the man who sat and watched the world forget him. And the woman who refused to. He didn't speak, not right away, and neither did she. She walked to the booth like her legs weighed 1,000 pounds, every step holding back a scream of questions. When she sat across from him, the air felt electric, heavy, sacred. He looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. I didn't deserve your kindness, she looked back. But you still got it. I didn't protect you. You weren't supposed to. You were supposed to be honest. A beat of silence. Then, I'm sorry. He meant it. Every syllable carried the weight of a man who had lost too much already, and nearly lost what little good he had left. Jane looked down at the soup. Steam rose between them. You know, she whispered. I used to think feeding someone was just about keeping them alive. She met his eyes again. But it's not. It's about telling them they matter. Connor's voice cracked. You were the first person in a long time who made me believe I still did. They sat for a long time. The soup went cold. But the silence was warm now. Real. Why didn't you come sooner? Jane asked. Not angry, just honest. Because I've only ever known how to build empires, not relationships. So what now? Connor pulled something from his coat pocket. It wasn't a card. It was a key. To what? Jane asked. To Maggie Miley's. I bought the place. Her eyes widened. Why would you? Because the town deserves to see where kindness begins. And because I want you to run it. She blinked. Me? You fed the hungry. Now I want you to lead the mission. I'll fund it. You feed them. Every person who's ever felt forgotten. She smiled, not big, not dramatic, but the kind of smile that meant she believed him again. "Do I still get to make soup?" she asked softly. Connor laughed. "Only if you teach me how not to burn the bread." They stood together outside the diner a little while later. The sun had just started rising, and with it so had the town. People passed by. Some stared, some didn't. But for the first time, Jane didn't care, and neither did he. "I don't want to be a chapter in your story," she said, watching the sky turn gold. "You're not," Connor replied. He turned to her. "You're the plot twist that saved mine." They didn't kiss. Not yet. This wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about redemption, respect, reconnection. Two souls who met in a place the world ignored and chose to see each other anyway. And maybe, just maybe, this whole time. That's the kind of love we're all looking for. So if this story made you feel something, not just entertained but seen, then don't leave without subscribing, because stories like this, they aren't just fiction, they're reminders that the world still has people who give soup to strangers and billionaires who still remember how to say thank you. Subscribe now for Jane, for Connor, for your own second chance, because somewhere out there, someone is watching you, hoping you're the kind one.